I'm starting from a number of premises in presenting these remarks to you here tonight. The first of these premises has to do with the fact that we live in an increasingly visual world. We're all aware of that, of course, though perhaps not necessarily consciously so. But I think we also all know a rather either happy or disquieting bit of statistics that is floating around that is quite accurate, namely that in the average American household at the present time, television is being viewed 6.5 hours a day per person. And as I said, this can be viewed either as a very positive thing or as a negative one, but in any case it indicates that visuals are here to stay, quite apart from what happens in film and on commercial movie screens or on independent movie screens. Secondly, in terms of my premises, the film field, the commercial film field, is dominated by huge communication networks, by huge commercial companies, in fact conglomerates, not merely companies, corporations, designed to create, of course, the largest possible return on their investment, as is true of all commercial business. In film, this has meant, over the years in commercial film, Hollywood, of course, and what we mean by Hollywood. It has meant that this particular medium, and speaking only of this medium, is in essence to be viewed as a business. And the best way of viewing it, and the only possible way of viewing it, is viewing it as a business. That means some people manufacture clothing and others manufacture movies. And once this very simple truth sinks in, a lot of other things follow and flow from it just as easily. For example, if one sells a commodity, one wants to sell it to the largest possible number of people because that will maximize one's profits. In relation to Hollywood, this has meant that one wants to reach the largest possible market, thereby aiming the films and the level of the films at the lowest common denominator, because that will get in the largest number of people. The result of that has been literally thousands of films over many, many years that essentially serve to reinforce a status quo, that essentially are designed not to antagonize people, but rather to lull them into a state of happy, pleased acquiescence. It means that in relation to Hollywood, we have fables, we have bland half-truths, we have questionable myths, we have violence, we have titillation, we have oversimplification. And all of this, of course, serves and succeeds in serving the largest possible number of people. The situation has worsened in recent years due to two extremely important factors. One is the rise of television and the competitive edge that has suddenly entered the film market. After all, Hollywood never had to contend with a separate and competitive visual medium, particularly one that at the present time is far larger than the commercial film field itself. That's the first problem, thereby creating a competitive problem for the commercial filmmakers. And secondly, the fact that the studios and the production companies in the cinema, in the commercial cinema, have been increasingly taken over by conglomerates. Now these are, I'm sure we're all acquainted with them, these are organizations, commercial enterprises that are not limited at all to one particular industry or one particular type of production, but rather extend, you might say, horizontally, and I should say globally and internationally in all directions. So that Many of the studios, well, to give you one example, Gulf and Western, as we know when we now we go to the movies, owns one of the major studios. Gulf and Western has absolutely nothing to do with film, but it has everything to do with film because it owns one of the major movie studios. What has been the result of these developments? The result has been, since now business methods are even more introduced than ever before, cost efficiency, etc. The result has been less risk-taking on the part of filmmakers and on the part of studios. And you know what that means. It means exactly what I'm trying to say. You take less risks and you make even more bland films in order to be sure that they will gain the acceptance they require. And the acceptance they require has to be rather widespread because films are more costly than ever. Production costs have gone up tremendously, and of course that in itself has reduced the willingness to take risks on the part of filmmakers and studios. Further, therefore, fewer films, larger films, but also fewer films. This is a simultaneous and concomitant development that's very important to bear in mind. A greater emphasis than ever before on spectacle films, on horror films, on films of superstition. All of these, again, designed to reach that largest possible audience. It has meant more than that. It has meant on an international scale that there are fewer national cinemas than there ever existed before. At one time it was possible to speak of an Italian cinema or of a French cinema, let us say. These have all been absorbed by the American production companies and the American conglomerates and multinationals that have invaded not only other fields of endeavor, but obviously also the international film industry, thereby creating a product that is becoming increasingly international in scope, westernized in scope, you might even say Americanized in scope. And all of these things we can obviously discuss after we have seen the films here tonight, but I'm just mentioning them now only. Finally, these trends have increased what I would call filmmaking by committee. It's no longer a few people or perhaps one person or whatever. It's large numbers of people getting together which very carefully design what a film should look like and what it should contain. Now, it has always been a well-kept secret that, although dominant, Hollywood really is only one segment of the film industry. Obviously, it is the most important one, the largest one. And I do not mean to imply that there are other cinemas around that are as important or almost as important as what we call Hollywood. That term has become a bit vague in recent years, but it's still useful. I think we all know what we mean by it when I use it. Now, there is, however, another kind of cinema, a cinema of independence and of artists, or another way of putting it is a cinema of individuals working on their own and without a committee and without having to give the right of the final editing, or what is called the final cut of the film, to some other third party, usually connected, of course, not usually, always connected with the producer, with the banks, with whoever put up the money. In this case, these are films that are inexpensive, cheaply made, usually only one person who feels that he wants to say something. He has something to say. He has something he must express. The films are not designed for a market, and they are not meant to reach the largest number of people. They are not created in terms of pigeonholes that they can fit in, where it's known demographically that either if the film is one kind of pigeonhole, it's going to reach 10 million people potentially. If it's in another kind of pigeonhole, it may reach 25 million people nationally. these filmmakers essentially do not really concern themselves with this issue. They're delighted if their film afterwards makes money or gets into some kind of distribution or is shown on public television or maybe on CBS once or on German television, which happens, by the way, quite frequently. But this is not the reason why they make these films. And of course, there are all kinds of films that are being made within this independent film area. That means all the documentaries you can think about nowadays, the political films, the educational films, the personal memoirs, the films about the aged, the films about sexual problems, the films about interpersonal problems, and avant-garde films, meaning experimental films, meaning films that attempt to create new modes and new codes in terms of expression, both in terms of form and in terms of content. And these are the kind of films that you're going to be, exposed to tonight in this program, because this is a program designed to show you new films in this particular area, the experimental film area, where people are attempting to push forward, let's say, the frontiers or the boundaries of the film medium and say perhaps old things in new ways or say new things in new ways. That is sort of the basis of the program tonight. Now, I'd like to read you a quote from a respected and, in fact, famous newspaper about an exhibition that took place in which 30 artists were represented, young artists, most of them completely unknown. Some were young, some were a bit older, and they were showing their works for the first time. And the reaction to this particular exhibition was one of dismay, hostility, and opposition, both on the part of audiences and on the part of the critics. So this quote that I'd like to read you from this newspaper goes as follows. The critic says, "Looking at the first of these rough works," and rough, says the critic, is the right word, "you simply shrug your shoulders. Seeing the next lot, you burst out laughing. But with the last ones, you finally get angry. And you are sorry you did not give the money you paid to get in to the show to some poor beggar outside." Now, this quote comes from La Patrie, a very famous French newspaper. Date is April 12, 1874. 1874, and the artists represented were Manet, Monet, Degas, Renoir, and Cézanne in their first public exhibition. In short, what we're talking about is the historically, of course, extremely important first exhibition anywhere of the great works of the Impressionist movement in painting. Today, these people, of course, are recognized as sublime masters, and in fact are not really considered experimental or daring or avant-garde, and certainly we have no difficulties when we look at their works to appreciate what they have done. Their works deal with family scenes, with interiors, with the joys and happiness of life, again, interpersonal relationships, women, families, parents, children, and in fact, especially with people like Renoir, we are delighted at the joy of life that emerges from these paintings and see no difficulty in watching them. Remember, however, that when they first came out, not only were they attacked, but they were in fact considered to be a hoax. Now, this is a very important realization, I think, for us, because it appears that in every generation, there is some kind of very peculiar, if not amazing, dichotomy between the artist and the audience, and I should say particularly the critic. The artists seem to be ahead of these other groups. They see further. They see perhaps more deeply. They're perhaps more sensitive, more attuned to what they're attempting to do than audiences or critics. Audiences and critics have a very peculiar stabilizing function. They always want to hold on to what has already previously been accepted and is therefore comfortable and easy to absorb. That's the role of audiences and critics, it appears. Artists, on the other hand, want to go forward. They have something new to say. They want to disturb in a certain particular way. And they do it, and of course then they pay the price. And it's only after they have died in poverty, I hate to be platitudinous, but it happens to be true. Read the biographies of these people. Only after they have died in poverty that somebody else, 100 years later, pays $1 million for one of their paintings, which is what's happening, as we all know, at the present time. Now, we must remember, we all know it in our own lives, and we don't like it. We must remember that all life is change, continuous, inevitable change. We don't like it. As soon as we have gotten hold of a little bit of certainty, I certainly include myself in that, we want to really hold on to it, and we think it's going to last forever. And then we're always surprised when suddenly there are new configurations and changes that occur, and that indeed indicate that the law of all life is change. Evolution, if you like. Not necessarily always for the better, by the way. We have had recent examples of that. My contention is that vis-a-vis the contemporary avant-garde or experimental film movement in film now, most critics and audiences are now in the same position as these critics and audiences were in relation to the Impressionist painters. You know, I'm making even more explicit and obvious something that I did much more than imply a few moments ago. And I think that the films you will see tonight very clearly can be seen to be part of the general movement in contemporary art, modernism in the arts, which can be broken down into a number of elements, and all I can do, of course, is only touch on a few of them here tonight, without obviously being able to go into any kind of detail. One of them has to do with the fact that in contemporary modern art, modernist art, postmodernist art, realism as a method, how should we put it, has disappeared. It exists on the fringes, but it doesn't exist in the center. And that's an important realization. So the one thing you're not going to see tonight is works that are predominantly realistic in either content or in form. Secondly, the conventional narratives and plots that we are so used to and that we see so beautifully portrayed, for instance, on the average television show, where everything proceeds in a very orderly, straightforward, clear, direct fashion from a point A to a point Z. This kind of straightforward, strong narrative, however stupid in content, has disappeared in terms of modern art and certainly modern cinema and certainly the kind of films you will see tonight. Either it's disappeared or it has been weakened or it has been changed to such an extent that it's no longer recognizable in the same fashion as the old style narrative and the old style conventional plot. Thirdly, there's an acceptance in these films and in all these works of what I would call the space-time continuum. You might say that Einstein, among others, not to speak of Freud and various other personages of our century, have entered the medium and have made it clear that indeed time cannot be viewed the way it used to be viewed in the old days, either as separate from space or even separate in terms of there's something being called the past, the present, the future. That instead there is a space-time continuum, that all these things flow into each other, that they're embedded within each other, that the past permeates the present and the future. And that's one reason why it's absolutely essential to study history and not to forget about it, as it's nowadays very common. And these realizations, the ability to switch and transpose past, present, future in art are apparent in these films as well, and are in fact an important component of them. Fourthly, continuity, still on the question of the narrative and the plot. What seems to be true of these films is that instead of having this horizontal narrative, from A to Z, the story begins over here, and then various things happen, delays, mishaps, and then you arrive at some kind of a successful conclusion over there. Instead of this horizontal narrative, you have vertical narratives, meaning you have instead exploration of states of mind, explorations of feelings, of emotions, in depth, in this direction. So that obviously you're not going to simultaneously necessarily have a story that proceeds in a horizontal fashion as well. And again, if you apply these criteria that I'm trying to hint at here to some of the films you will see tonight, they will become perhaps more understandable and perhaps also therefore more acceptable to you. What I'm really talking about in regard to all these criteria I've mentioned here, what I'm really talking about is what might be called the intrusion into film art of names such as, and by the way, I could give you another 20, but I'll only give you a few here. Kafka, that's already more acceptable nowadays than it was initially. Joyce, Faulkner, Stockhausen, Proust, Eliot, Picasso, Pollock, conceptual art, and I could go on with 20 other names in all of the fields of contemporary art. Martha Graham in dance and what followed Martha Graham, including present-day dance companies, can go on, can go very wide, very far afield. Now, I don't mean to imply that the films you will see tonight are either the equivalent of Joyce or of Renoir. That's not my intention. I'm implying that they operate within the same areas of concern or endeavor, and that some show greater promise and greater talent than others. But after this has been said, you, I'm sure, must realize that indeed, as I feel, these films are a kind of an invitation to you. They ask you to open yourself to something fairly new, fairly different, not the usual thing, and to see as these artists see with new eyes. That's really what is behind these films. That's the spirit in which they are presented to you, and in the spirit which I hope you will accept them. Speaking for myself, I even go a step further, but that maybe, again, could be discussed during our afterwards, after you've seen the films. I also view these films in a certain sense as Quaker witnesses, meaning that even if they are few and far between, and even if they don't represent necessarily the majority, at the same time, they take a certain stand, make a certain point, and for me, are important for that reason alone. They may be humble, they may be poverty-stricken, but I think they're witnesses of what might be in terms of cinema, or what might have been. Thank you very much. The actor-spectator is a very important one, because I think increasingly, particularly in relation to television, we have become more and more passive, of course, and uninvolved. And no, not uninvolved, but more passive. We don't really have to work for a living, so to speak, in order to appreciate what's being presented. And everything that is being presented is sort of given to us on a platter. And on a platter, it's very obvious kind of food. It's not, delicacies or gourmet style food, but it's very, down-to-earth type of things. Now, the point you're raising about this, though, is very important, I feel, because it has to do with something that I might call, it's not a very good term, visual literacy. Just as there's other kinds of verbal literacy, there's also in relation to images. Namely that obviously as one gets more and more exposed to such images, or the multiplicity of techniques that are being used in these films, one becomes more attuned to them. And that's an inevitable process. And the reverse is also an inevitable process. The less you get attuned to such things, the less literate you are, or the less you are able to understand or to appreciate or to see or to read or to grasp, whatever. There's a price we pay for the Reader's Digest. We do get a lot of stuff, fast, but what we get is on such a superficial level, as we all know, that we're really not getting anything or very much. So the real problem, I think one of the real problems we have nowadays in our society and culture is the fact that we're being increasingly, I think, either robbed of our literacy, verbal and visual, or we're never educated toward it. We never get to that point, really. And I think that's a very serious matter. Self-indulgent. I understand what you're saying. The wonderful thing with that kind of statement is always that, of course, it's entirely up to the person saying it. I may find Griffin's film not self-indulgent. On the other hand, I've certainly seen films, perhaps longer films or perhaps different kinds of films, where I felt it was a kind of self-indulgence. It's just that you have to understand that these are subjective statements, inevitably. You're expressing yourself when you say that, which is the way it ought to be, in a sense, right? But it doesn't mean that you're expressing either the views of others or of the filmmaker, So I don't quite know what one can do with this, It's interesting to know, but I don't know where we can go with it,
I found myself being very impressed by things that I had never seen before, never seen being done. Sometimes I had the impression that stop it and make a painting after. I was
Well, there's a program note. Did you get a program note? There's a program note about all of the films, which, by the way, you should definitely look at, because it does deal with that. I've been told to use this mic because, videotape for posterity or something. The point there is that this is a young woman who wanted to document an entire year in her life in film, or by means of film. And this is sort of 1 month, this film. And it refers to an unresolved relationship, of course, which in fact is in the past, and she remembers it. And she remembers it, can't get it out of her mind, so to speak, and he has a face, and indeed she has no face. She's very much aware of it. Not only aware of it, she made a film, you know. And there is no resolution to it, except in the sense that it gets worse, you might say. That she says she reaches a state of complete emptiness. It's in a program note. Whether she succeeds in doing that is another matter. But you know what? I've forgotten the first point you made. What was that first thing you said? Was something you want to refer to? Yeah, but you were looking, yeah, and then you were glad about that little man with the paper. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm.
But I think I kind of yearn for humanity.
But you know, again, how is that expressed? It doesn't necessarily have to be expressed in the ways to which we are accustomed, and therefore we accept them. I mean, the everyday kind of things in what we read in newspapers, you know, the human interest type of stories, or the kind of things we see on television. It can be expressed in other ways. For example, the first film, this very strange film with 3 different screens superimposed on a beach resort, you know, was made by someone who lives in Australia, but who as a young man came to Australia from what he calls Northern Europe, Northern Germany, where they didn't have beaches like that. And he fell in love with that beach. Again, I'm quoting the program notes here. He fell in love with that beach, spent many, many hours there, and he's trying to show you in his own way, you know, in a different kind of way, the feelings he has, the joy of it, the people, the whiteness of the beach, and also perhaps a kind of complexity about it that he feels, but that maybe we don't necessarily feel when we go to a beach, you know. But it might be interesting to see how another human being responds to it, and he does that in that film. Or I'm talking about humanity in these films. You see, there's one example. Then you've got the young man whose father is dying. Well, that's a very daring thing to do, to make a film like that, as if seen through the father's eyes, practically. That's a human kind of a thing. The young woman, you know, with this... You see it. Yeah, well, I'm fascinated by this conversation because I have a very different reaction to it. To me, this scene is the high point of the film. The high point of the film. It's where his sorrow and the depth of his feelings comes out most directly, as far as I'm concerned. And there are a number of things that are interesting about it from my point of view. The fact that he's got all the credits beforehand and ends in a very formal sense, he ends the film. Now we have gotten used over the years to credits appearing, to film appearing before the credits. But we are not yet used to credits at the end of the film where some important part of the action continues after the credits, or takes place, begins after the end credits. Because in this film, you know, at the end he says, he's got all the credits, and then suddenly he's got epilogue, and this is very disturbing. It's number one. So that's daring already, in terms of style, stylistically daring. Secondly, he becomes extremely personal at that point, and this is also a trend in contemporary avant-garde and personal and serious, whatever you want to call it, filmmaking or art. It's called self-reflexivity. It's bringing the person into the person who made the film, in a sense, more directly into the film and revealing that this is indeed a personal statement rather than some kind of abstract, thing that comes down from heaven, a film, you see. And the filmmaker does that, I think, very well. But these are all, obviously, I can see now. Huh? I can assure you that there are people with as much or more film literacy than I have who would disagree with me. So you don't have to, there's no, we still have different views. Or no, it's not different views, it's that we are all different people and we respond differently. We respond in terms of our entire lives, When you respond that way, you've got the weight of your entire past, what your parents did to you at age 2, in my case, age 1, and it's all there. That's what taste really is, or what we call, our immediate, raw, instinctive reactions. Where do they come from? I mean, it's partly genetic, without a doubt. And it's partly, to be even more trite, environmental and etc.
You were older than 30, you've read some books, which have in fact, I didn't mean to say people younger than 30 haven't read books, but I think we were, maybe I better speak for myself, maybe I'm not the oldest person in the room.
Well, there's no doubt whatsoever. I totally agree with you. Yes. The more influences we have, the more things impinge on us, the more things we let impinge on us in our daily lives, the richer our lives will be, ultimately, of course. So, and it doesn't have to be books. It can be other kinds of experiences as well. But books is a very good avenue towards deeper experience. Yes, that's why I'm happy to be in this building. It's sort of I feel like we are part of a frontier society, and we're living on the outskirts of another kind of society in which these buildings are no longer as important as they should be. But that's another question. Yes?
See a lot of independent films on public TV, and it seems to have like a common purpose.
Seems like what?
They sort of both try to really, show good as opposed to
yeah. 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 Well, I have very complex feelings about public TV, you see. On the one hand, I think there's no doubt whatsoever. I think I'm in total agreement with what you're saying, what I think you're driving at, because there's no doubt that you can see many more independent films, for example, if you want to talk about independent cinema, on public TV than you will nowadays see in commercial movie theaters or on regular commercial on the networks, network TV. There's no doubt about that. Particularly if you watch 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, you're more apt to see that kind of thing at prime time, of course. On the other hand, knowing the wealth of material that's available in the independent film field, I can only assure you that, number one, they're only scratching the surface, and number two, they're extremely selective as to what they show and don't show. Definitely. Definitely. It's like saying it operates on a different level in relation to independent cinema than the networks do. But just like the networks have constraints, and there's a point, up to here, no further. The same is true of public television. So, they'll more readily show a BBC series on public television in the United States, then they will show some truly outstanding American independent films. And I'm not talking about the films you saw here tonight, or this kind of film even. You know, independent is a very wide, as I tried to indicate, has a very wide range to it. Well, there was a case recently I heard from Mrs. Katz that you showed the Song of the Canary here. Well, that's a very important social documentary about you know, the problem of safety and poisons in factory situations and workers. I don't know whether you've seen it or not. A very important American documentary. And that film, it took it 3 years before it was finally, with a lot of pressure and protest and a lot of you know, articles being written about it, before public television finally dared to show the film. They were extremely reluctant. This is only one example. There are, unfortunately, too many others. But on the other hand, after that 3-year delay, finally they showed it. Okay, great. So, you know, so you understand, it's a...
You get to see more, and each time you see the one independent film is good by not showing a lot of the
Yeah, right. No. No. I mean something else. Of course there are good things sometimes that come out. I mean that, first of all, if the people who control the funding of these films, of the large commercial films, if they have to make a choice between art and commerce, there's no doubt whatsoever as to what they will choose. If they can get art with commerce, you see, they're happy because they're happy as well, and they'll accept it and use it and to show it because it gives them also a kind of a cultural cachet as well as money in the bank. What could be better? But the first thing, you know, is the money in the bank. So, and then, you know, I've been watching, you know, I've been looking and watching films and knowing filmmakers and working with them. Well, it's almost, I think, 30 years now. Well, there are too many stories about filmmakers who worked in the commercial field as artists and in a sense were allowed to make one film or maybe 2 films, and then if they didn't work too well at the box office, out they went and they disappeared even though they were extremely talented, while all kinds of mediocre craftsmen who are not even, they're technicians, they're not even artists, keep on making films because they know how to reach a larger audience. So that's the problem, see? But of course, from time to time, art, you know, has a way of invading these areas. Sure, absolutely. I don't want to be, I don't want to give the impression that some good films have not come out of the commercial field, of course. No question. There are no questions that are simple. You know, everything is very, you know.
Even public television has the problem of collecting money, and perhaps they are influenced by what they hear from their donors.
Without the slightest doubt. How's that for an answer? Without the slightest doubt. And I noticed, you know, the Chubb group of insurance companies, I don't know who they are, they're all over my screen there from time to time, and it's a commercial. Of course, that's why it's there. It's a commercial. It's a very dignified kind of commercial. It doesn't come every 15 minutes. But then if it doesn't come every 15 minutes, if it only comes perhaps at the end, perhaps we or our kind of people look at it even more carefully and are more affected by it. Or Exxon, or Mobil Oil, right? And they got their own network. It's called the Mobil Network, they say in their ads. You know, that's what they call it. This is all done for the same purposes for which the other companies create commercials on commercial television. There's no difference as far as I'm concerned. Yes, yes. I yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yes, it is. That's a good point, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
It's a risk-taking media by
yeah. Yeah. They're also imitating, you know, speaking about public television, they're also imitating some of the worst aspects of commercial television. For instance, these, I'm sure you have them here as well as in New York, these auctions, the auctions to raising money. Well, I'm not talking about the auction itself, which I could speak, 2 hours minimum on that question, but leaving that aside for a moment, the fact that they fool you, they tell you you're going to see, I don't know, Sophia Loren, say, from my point of view, right, in the next minute or so, and then you sit there, and instead you have all these people with the phones, and it goes on forever, and then they got certain station breaks telling you what they're going to show next week and all this, and you have to wait a half hour, just like on commercial television, before you're going to see that Sophia Loren, you see. And this is the same kind of contempt, as far as I'm concerned, and manipulation of the viewer as occurs in commercial television, where this kind of thing happens, of course, all the time. We know it, right? Good Morning America or something. They tell you that in 5 minutes you're going to find out about a father who slept with 3 of his daughters, and some other things happen simultaneously. And you have to wait a long time before you're going to see one shot of that father, maybe, you know. But we're all very curious, so we stick with it and then get all the commercials for deodorants and dishwashing, whatever, which is the really important part about television, you know. Did you know that the programming on TV is not important? The only thing that's important are the commercials. Everything is built around the commercials in terms of the other things are the spaces in between that have to be filled up. Got to sell things. That's the important thing.
Concentrate on the marvelous animation techniques. You try to forget about what they're selling.
I absolutely refuse to do that. I refuse to do that. I think it's an abomination. It's a, what do you call it? I mean, we have to be able to apply values to everything, I think, if we're human beings. And I'm not very proud of great artists. I wouldn't be happy if Michelangelo made some great Jordache commercial. I wouldn't be happy about it. I think he shouldn't do it. And don't forget that these are the jobs that are available for most young artists now, or young filmmakers, or what have you. I see it time and again with students in the schools. Where do they go? They go into commercial production afterwards, you know. We try to teach them about the aesthetic theories of Eisenstein and Balázs and who knows what. And the end result is, you know, they use this very effective shock editing and all that to sell jeans. Of course, of course, of course. Listen, I don't blame them. I don't say they're bad people. I just don't, I don't have to be happy about it or about my role in the process, right?
What happens to these people who are the aesthetic? What is going to happen to these people?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Many of these independents really go on one way or the other making films on their own. They try to get grants and they get the grants, or they raise money somehow, or they work on odd jobs. The man who made Bondi is a very good example, the one with the beach that I mentioned in Australia. When he came to Australia, he was a bricklayer for many years, working on a part-time basis and made avant-garde films simultaneously. Now he's a builder. He still works part-time, but he makes enough money to pay for his own films. See? Then there are other people who fall by the wayside. There are other people who go into commercial production, and that's the end of that. They're being rich. They're rich, and that's the way they spend their money. There's that group too. There are all kinds of people in the world. So that's the answer. But you know, there are distribution networks throughout the United States, also abroad, where these films are rented and sold, and libraries buy them, and groups buy them, individuals buy them. Then in Europe, television is much more progressive, at least in some countries, than here. So that, for example, in Western Germany, I would say that the American independents have probably made more money from Western German television than they have made from the American independent 16mm market in any given 10-year, not any given, say in the last 10-year period. You know what I mean? And by the way, they're also shown in prime time there. So this is all very fascinating, not only in Germany, elsewhere too.
Is this
So,
where your center of interest lies, with the independents?
I've always been very close to them, and my work at Cinema 16 also has been very much, you know, influenced and involved with that. However, it's no. For example, many of the very well-known directors were shown here. I mean, I'm talking about big non-independent directors, were first premiered or shown here by me, introduced by me, yes. Some very surprising names, I would say. You know, I don't know. I can't even remember anymore. You know, I mean, I have it written down, but I don't know, Polanski, Bertolucci, the first Antonioni sequence ever shown in America, not sequence, episode was shown by me, you know. I don't know, there's a lot of names, not very useful going into it, but it just indicates that I'm not, you know, married to the independent film field only. But it's a fascinating field because, you see, there's really no contradiction between saying one is interested in I don't know, Bergman or Antonioni or Bertolucci and these independents, because those guys on a different level try to do the same thing, you know, to make statements, not to be commissioned to do a film, but to make a statement because they wanted or needed to make a statement, you know. And there are some people who can still now are able to continue to do so. You know, I have a lot of respect for people like Bergman, for example, whether I like his work or not, because he makes only those films really he wants to make. And I'm afraid that's not true of too many people. And I'm sorry about it.
What do you think of Redford's first attempt with Ordinary People? And
Did he have
to get the money for that himself?
He's got the money. There's no problem there. And he was...
Had he tried anywhere else and it was refused?
I don't know about it, but he didn't need to go that route because he had the money, and I'm not saying only his money was in that film, of course not, but he's able in his position to get money from others on the strength of his name, whatever. I was very pleasantly surprised by that film, notwithstanding Pauline Kael, who apparently hated it. I haven't read her review. I was very pleasantly surprised by that film, though I don't think it's about ordinary people. I think it's about an upper-class family.
I don't think that they know how to deal with more than one priority issue. The same thing was also true with Kramer versus Kramer. One child was only involved.
Yeah.
Well-adjusted, adorable, one child instead of 3 children of various ages. And of course, again, money was no factor there either.
Mm-hmm.
I think that their explanation of that is
I know it's the explanation. I think it's much easier to be unhappy in a large house with good, you know, you have good plates when you eat. It's much easier than in Harlem.
they think it would be too ugly if they put reality out there.
How many people want to see reality, you know, in this kind of a situation with mass audiences? Okay, thank you very much.